If ransomware locked your machine tonight, you already know roughly how it would arrive. A link, an attachment, something you clicked. The first one did not arrive that way. It came in an envelope with a stamp on it, delivered by a postman to about 20,000 people who had asked for information about AIDS. December 1989. The disk is labeled AIDS Information. Introductory diskettes. It is a real health questionnaire. It works. And it counts. In the next half hour, you get exactly how it worked, why it failed, and the strange fact at the center of it, the man who built it printed his ransom terms on the license agreement that shipped inside the box with his company's name on it. Stay to the end, and you get the part that matters tonight. The single mistake he made that kept 1989 survivable, and the day in the 1990s when somebody published the fix for that mistake and made everything that came after possible. To understand why this worked at all, you have to put yourself in 1989, and it is further away than you think. There is no web. Tim Berners-Lee is writing his proposal at CERN that year. The first website is still 2 years off. For almost everybody with a computer on a desk, there is no network of any kind. Your machine is an island. Nothing arrives on it unless somebody physically carries something to it. And the thing they carry is a floppy disk. So the floppy disk is the network. It is how software is bought, how documents move between offices, how a colleague gives you a spreadsheet. And crucially, it is how information arrives from institutions you trust. Now add the second thing about 1989, which is not technical at all. AIDS is the most frightening subject in the world. There is no effective treatment. A diagnosis is widely understood as a death sentence. Every health ministry, every research institute, every hospital, and a great many ordinary people are desperate for reliable information about risk. So imagine what lands on the desk, a padded envelope. Inside, a floppy disk, professionally produced, labeled AIDS Information, Introductory Diskettes. Documentation, a license agreement like real software has. And on many of those desks, the recipient is exactly the sort of person who would have expected it. Somebody who attended a World Health Organization AIDS conference in Stockholm that year, or who subscribes to a medical or scientific mailing list. The disks went out from London by post. Accounts put the number at around 20,000, some counts put it higher. They reached something in the region of 90 countries. And here's the thing that separates this from every attack you have read about since. It did not need a vulnerability. There was no exploit, no bug, no clever technical trick to get onto the machine. It was invited in. Somebody read the label, believed it, and put it in the drive themselves. Which is, if you think about it honestly, still how most ransomware gets in today. The delivery mechanism moved from the postal service to email, and nothing else about that sentence changed. And I want to spend one more minute on the machine itself, because the defenses you assume exist simply were not there. The operating system on most of those desks is DOS. It has no concept of a user account. There is no administrator and no ordinary user, because there is nobody to distinguish. The machine assumes one person, and that person is allowed to do everything. So there is no permission to escalate, no password to steal, no privilege boundary to cross. Any program you run can rewrite any file on the disk, including the ones the computer reads, to start itself. It is not a security failure. Security was not a design goal, because the threat model was theft of the physical box. There is also, for most of these machines, no antivirus software, because that industry barely exists yet. A handful of small companies and a scattering of researchers, mostly in Europe, exchanging samples by post and telephone. And the last piece, there is no backup. Not because people were careless, but because backing up a 20 megabyte hard disk means feeding it something like 60 floppy disks by hand, one at a time, sitting there swapping them. Most people did it rarely, many never did it at all. So the target is a machine with no isolation, no detection, and no recovery, operated by somebody with an excellent reason to trust the envelope. It is difficult to design a softer target, and it was the standard configuration of the entire professional world. So you put the disk in. What happens? First, and this is important, it installs and it works. This is not a fake. You get a real interactive questionnaire about AIDS risk factors, behavior, exposure, circumstances, and at the end it gives you an assessment of your risk. By the standards of 1989, that is a genuinely useful piece of software, and it is doing the job it says on the label. Somebody wrote it seriously. That matters for two reasons. The first is that it removes suspicion completely. The program did the thing it promised. There was no moment where anybody thought, this is not what it claimed to be. The second reason is more uncomfortable, and we will come back to it. Whoever made this had real subject knowledge. This was not a teenager pasting something together. The questionnaire content was the work of somebody who understood the epidemiology. While you are answering questions about your risk, the program is quietly doing its other work. It writes itself into the system so that it runs every time the machine starts, and it modifies the file the computer reads on boot to make sure of it. And then it does the thing that makes this whole story what it is. It starts counting. It starts counting. Not a date, not a timer. It counts the number of times you switch the computer on. And it does nothing at all for weeks. Think about how well chosen that is. 90 boots is, for an office machine in 1989, something like 3 or 4 months. By then, the envelope is in a bin. The disk is in a drawer with 50 others. Nobody on Earth is going to connect what happened this morning to a disk they installed 1 working quarter ago. The delay is not a technical feature. It is the whole defense, and it is a psychological one. And notice the second thing the counter buys, which is subtler. 20,000 disks did not all go into drives on the same day. They went in over weeks, as post arrived and people got around to it. So the triggers do not happen together either. They happen spread out over months, 1 desk at a time, in 90 different countries. There is no moment where a pattern is visible to anybody. Today that would be caught in hours because the machines talk to each other and somebody is watching the aggregate. In 1989, each victim experienced this as a private, isolated disaster and had no way of knowing that anybody else in the world had seen the same screen. That is worth naming because it is the thing that actually changed between then and now, not the attacks, the visibility. The reason a modern campaign gets a name within a day is that the telemetry exists to see it as one event. And now the detail that makes this the strangest case in the history of computer crime, because he told them, in advance, in writing. Inside the package was a license agreement. Ordinary software came with one. Nobody read them then either. This one, read carefully, described what was about to happen. It explained that using the program meant agreeing to pay for a license. It set out the price. It stated that if you did not pay, there would be consequences for your computer, and it described them in terms that were not really ambiguous at all. The price was $189 for a license covering 365 uses, or $378 for a lifetime license. Payment to be sent to PC Cyborg Corporation at a post office box in Panama. Sit with that. This is not a ransom note that appears after the attack. It is a ransom note that shipped with the product, in the box, before anything happened, dressed as a contract. And I think that is the key to the entire case, though we cannot prove what was in his head. This does not read like somebody hiding. It reads like somebody who believed he had constructed something legally clever, that if the terms were disclosed and you proceeded anyway, then this was a licensing dispute rather than a crime. It is a spectacular misreading of how the law works, and it had a very practical consequence. The license carried the name of a corporation, and it was traceable. The author of the first ransomware attack in history shipped his own return address with it. And you have to put that against what licenses were in 1989, because it is not as absurd as it sounds from here. This is the beginning of the shrink-wrap era, when the industry's position was that tearing the plastic off a box constituted agreement to whatever was printed inside it. Software companies genuinely asserted in those years that they could impose sweeping conditions on you through a document you were only allowed to read after you had bought the product and opened it. Whether that was enforceable was actively being argued. So somewhere in that argument, a man appears to have concluded that if the industry can bind you to terms you did not negotiate simply because you used the disk, then he could bind you to these ones. it is worth saying clearly what the actual difference is, because it is the whole distinction between a bad contract and a crime. A license can tell you what you owe. It cannot authorize the other party to break your property when you do not pay. Nobody gets to write, "If you do not pay, I will come and change the locks on your house," and do a contract and have that stand. Disclosure does not convert damage into a remedy. You do not get to consent your way into being attacked, and a court does not accept a receipt as a defense. There is one more thing this tells us, and it is the closest we get to evidence of intent. He did not hide the trigger, the price, or the identity of the company. Whatever he thought he was doing, he does not appear to have thought he was doing something he needed to conceal. And there is a practical reason that piece of paper mattered enormously, beyond the psychology of it. Payment had to go somewhere. This is 34 years before anybody can be paid anonymously. There is no cryptocurrency. $189 has to physically travel, a check, a money order, an envelope, to an address that exists and be collected by somebody who can be watched collecting it. That is why the postbox in Panama is the weakest component in the entire scheme, and it is why the money side of this collapsed almost immediately while the technical side was still spreading. Modern ransomware did not become an industry because the malware got better. It became an industry the moment there was a way to be paid at scale without an envelope arriving somewhere a person has to stand. Pop had the idea, the delivery, the trigger, and the leverage. He had no way to get paid, and there was no way for him to have one. Then, the counter reaches 90, and the machine that has been fine for 3 months restarts one more time. What appears on screen is not a skull and not a threat. It looks like a bill, a demand for payment on the software license with an amount and an address in Panama. And the drive is unusable. The directories are hidden. Every file name has been turned into a meaningless string of characters. Nothing you knew how to find is findable. Now here is the technical point that this whole episode turns on, and almost every retelling gets it wrong. It did not encrypt the contents of your files. It scrambled the names. And it hid the directory structure. Your data, the actual bytes of every document, every dataset, every column of results was still sitting on that disk completely intact, exactly where it had always been. It was a filing cabinet with every label torn off and the drawers glued shut. Which, if you do not know that, is functionally identical to having lost everything. And in December 1989, almost nobody knew that. And you could not simply look either, which is the part that is hard to feel now. There is no search bar, there is no preview pane, there are no thumbnails, and no file type icons. The way you find anything on a DOS machine is that you type a command and it prints a list of names. The names are the entire interface. Take the names away and there is nothing else to navigate by. You are standing in front of a wall of nonsense strings with no way to tell a 5-year dataset from a letter to a supplier. That is why an attack that changed nothing about your data was, in practice, indistinguishable from one that destroyed it. The attacker did not have to reach the contents. He only had to reach the index, and the index was the only sense the system had. It is a genuinely clever piece of work, and I say that with no admiration for what it was used for. He found the cheapest possible place to apply force. So consider who was sitting at those machines: medical researchers, health ministries, institutes working on the biggest public health emergency of the era. Some of them did the thing that people do when a machine has gone wrong and the work is irreplaceable and the panic is total. They wiped it, they reformatted the disk, and started again from whatever they had on paper. And that is the real damage of the AIDS Trojan. Not money extracted. As far as anyone can establish, the scheme did not pay. The damage was research work destroyed by people trying to save it, from an attack that had not actually deleted anything. That is worth carrying with you because it is still true. In an incident, the panic response does more damage than the payload more often than anybody likes to admit. The first instruction in every serious response plan ever written is stop. Do not wipe anything. Take an image of the disk before you touch it. 1989 did not have that plan. 1989 had a room full of frightened people and a screen demanding $189 to a postbox in Panama. The response, though, is genuinely encouraging. And it happened faster than you would expect from a world with no internet. Within weeks, people in what was then a very small antivirus community had taken the program apart, and what they found was the flaw that defines the whole first generation of this idea. The scrambling. Use symmetric cryptography. One key, the same key, locks and unlocks, which means the key has to be somewhere the program can reach it, and the program was sitting right there on the victim's machine. That is the fatal design error, and everything else follows from it. If the software that locked your files is on your computer, then the thing that unlocks your files is on your computer. Somebody just has to read the code and find it. And understand what read the code meant in 1990, because there is no help available. There is no source code, no documentation, and no vendor to ask. Somebody sits down with the raw machine instructions and works backwards, by hand, until they can say what every part of the program does. Days of work on a program deliberately written to be awkward to follow, with a wrong answer costing somebody their data. And they were not doing it for a client. There was no security industry to bill. They were researchers and hobbyists who thought this should not be allowed to stand, working evenings, exchanging notes by telephone and post. So they read it, they found it, and free recovery tools were written and circulated, the best known distributed under the name AidesOut, that undid the damage and gave people their file names back. And think about how those tools traveled in a world with no web, on disks, in the post, through user groups, magazine cover disks, and phone calls between institutions. The cure moved exactly the same way the disease had, which gives 1989 a clean ending that we do not get anymore. The attack was universally recoverable. Every single victim could be given their data back for free by strangers within weeks. Hold that thought, because it is the difference between then and now, and the reason for it is one specific piece of mathematics that had not yet been applied to this problem. Before we get there, it is worth asking why the antivirus community existed at all in 1989, because it had only just come into being, and this incident is part of the reason it hardened into a profession. For most of the 1980s, computer infections were an oddity. Clever, mostly harmless, often written to prove a point. The response to them was correspondingly informal. A few people who found it interesting, publishing findings in specialist newsletters. This was different in kind, and everybody who looked at it knew immediately. It had a business model. It had a corporate identity, a price list, and a payment address. It targeted a specific professional community by name, using their fear of a disease. That is the moment the field stops being a curiosity. You cannot treat something as a hobby when the target is a health ministry and the mechanism is extortion. And the response set a pattern that has held for 35 years. Take it apart, publish what you find, and give the fix away rather than sell it. The reason that norm exists is that the first time this happened, the people who could fix it simply did and did not charge for it. And the name on the license led straight to a person, which is how we know who did this at all. Dr. Joseph L. Popp Jr. was a Harvard-educated evolutionary biologist, not a programmer by trade, a scientist with a career in the field, including work in East Africa and on age-related programs. Which answers the question from earlier about why the questionnaire was good. It was written by somebody who genuinely knew the material. That is the most unsettling detail in the story, and it never gets easier. And it breaks the picture people carry around of who does this, which is worth pausing on for a moment because that picture is still wrong in the same way today. The image is a young outsider, technically brilliant, socially detached, working alone at night against institutions he resents. It is a comfortable image because it puts the danger outside the room. This was a middle-aged scientist with a Harvard doctorate and a field career who had worked on the very programs his targets worked on and who had the mailing list because he belonged on it. He did not break into that community. He was inside it. The discs reached exactly the right desks because he knew which desks those were, and the label was persuasive because he knew what the people at those desks were afraid of. That is the pattern that has actually persisted. The most effective attacks are almost never the most technically impressive ones. They are the ones written by somebody who understands the target's working day well enough to know precisely which envelope gets opened. He was identified quickly, because of course he was. His corporate identity was printed inside the package he had mailed to 20,000 people. And then, the case takes a turn that no amount of technical analysis prepares you for. Traveling back towards the United States, he drew the attention of authorities at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam after writing on another passenger's luggage that he had been poisoned. He was arrested and eventually faced proceedings in the United Kingdom on blackmail-related charges. In November 1991, the court found that he was not fit to stand trial. The case did not proceed. I want to be precise because precision matters more than drama here. Joseph Popp was never convicted of anything in connection with this, which means the question everyone wants answered, why, has no answer, and I'm not going to invent one for you. Explanations were offered at the time ranging from mental illness to a grievance over funding. None of them has ever been established. It is genuinely unknown. What we do know is that he went back to biology. He wrote, he worked, and in Oneonta, New York, he opened a butterfly conservatory which carries his name and is still open to the public. He died in 2007. First ransomware attack in history was written by a man who spent the end of his life building a room where butterflies fly around children. History does not tidy itself up for us. And there is one more thing the case left behind, which is not about him at all. It exposed the fact that nobody knew what this was. The charges brought were blackmail related because blackmail was the closest existing shape. There was no offense on the books that described what had actually happened because what had actually happened was not a category anybody had needed yet. That gap took years to close, and it closed in different countries at different speeds and in different words. Every one of those laws was written after somebody had already done the thing, which is the permanent condition of this field. So it is fair to say the AIDS Trojan was the first of two things. Not one, the first ransomware attack, and one of the first times a legal system had to look at a computer and decide what crime it was looking at. Now the part that connects 1989 to your newsfeed this week. Because the idea did not fail, the implementation failed. Remember the flaw, one key, present on the victim's machine, therefore findable. For that to become a real weapon, the attacker needs a way to lock your files with something that cannot unlock them. That mathematics already existed. Public key cryptography had been published in the 1970s. You have a pair of keys. One locks, one unlocks, and knowing the first does not give you the second. In 1996, two researchers, Adam Young and Modi Young, published the paper that spelled out what happens if you point that at extortion. They called the field cryptovirology, and they described the design explicitly. The design is this. The attacker keeps the private key. The malware carries only the public key. It locks your files with something that is, mathematically, a one-way door, and the thing that opens it never touches your computer at any point. Now go back and rerun 1989 with that change, and notice that nothing else about the attack has to improve. Same delivery. Same trigger, same demand. Except now, the antivirus community can take the program apart, read every line of it, understand it perfectly, and still be unable to give anybody their files back. The recovery tool cannot exist. There is nothing to find. That is the entire history of ransomware in one sentence. Everything since has been logistics. Better delivery, better targeting, cryptocurrency for payment, affiliate programs, data theft, and publish as a second lever. And it is worth being specific about what logistics now means, because the shape of the modern business is the interesting part. The people who write the malware are frequently not the people who use it. The code is rented out, with a support desk, a dashboard, and a cut of whatever gets paid. The person who breaks into the network may be a third party again, who did nothing but obtain a password and sell it on. So the thing that attacks a hospital is not a hacker in the film sense. It is a supply chain with specialists in it. And the specialization is exactly why it works. Each part of it is done by somebody who does only that. The second lever is newer, and it neatly defeats the advice everybody finally learned. Copy the data out before locking it, and then the threat is not only that you cannot get your files back, it is that your files will be published. Which means a perfect backup no longer ends the conversation. It ends the extortion about availability. It does nothing about the extortion regarding disclosure, and that is now the part that gets paid. But notice that none of this is a cryptographic advance. The mathematics stopped moving in 1996. Everything after that is business model, and the business model is what turned a one-man scheme with a Panama Post box into an industry. But the core is a 1989 idea plus a 1996 correction, and by the time CryptoLocker made this a global industry in 2013, the mathematics had been public and unfixable for 17 years. And that is why the defense has not changed either. If the key is unreachable, then decryption is not a strategy. The only thing that beats it is having a copy of your data that the attack could not touch. There is one honest exception worth mentioning, because people do get their files back sometimes without paying, and it is never because the encryption was beaten. It is because the implementation was wrong. Somebody reused a key across victims, or generated it from something predictable, or left it behind in memory, or a law enforcement operation seized the server the keys were sitting on and published them. That is why free decryptors exist for some families and not others, and it is why the security community treats every seized server as a chance to hand thousands of people their data back at once. But notice what all of those have in common. They are mistakes and they are luck. None of them is a defense you can plan around, and none of them is available on the night it happens to you. So what do you actually take from a floppy disk mailed in 1989? 4 things, and every one of them is still operational tonight. 1. The delivery has never been the clever part. That disk got in because somebody trusted the label. Every serious ransomware attack since has gotten the same way, through a person who had a good reason to open something. 2. In an incident, do not wipe. The worst losses of 1989 were caused by people destroying data that had not been destroyed. Take a copy of the disk before anybody touches it. That rule was written in blood, and it is still first on the list. 3. Backups only count if the attack could not reach them. A backup drive plugged into the machine is not a backup, it is a second victim. Offline or off-site or immutable and tested, because a backup nobody has ever restored from is a belief, not a plan. 4. Since 1996, paying has not been a recovery plan. The key never comes to you. You are buying a promise from a stranger who has already lied to you once. And the 5th thing, which is not a rule, the people who broke this open in 1990 were volunteers, sharing what they found by post because there was no other way to share it. That is where the security community started, and it is still the reason most of this ever gets fixed. Next Wednesday on Dark History of the Internet, before ransomware, before the dark web, there were programs that spread simply because they could, carried by hand on floppy disks between school computers and shops. Elk Cloner, written by a 15-year-old as a joke, and Brain, written by 2 brothers who put their real address in the code. If you want the rest of this history, follow the channel. That is the whole ask. See you next Wednesday.